Welcome to Commander Central, episode 267, and today we'll be talking about how we go about choosing the number of tools in our toolboxes. I'm Dana.
I'm Max.
And I'm Chris.
What's up, boys? How's it going today?
I heard you say what we're talking about, and I instantly went to, Home Improvement, Tim the Toolman Taylor, and that laugh he did, and I don't know why. So happy Friday, everybody.
Making a run to Harbor Freight this afternoon to buy some cheap screwdrivers or something.
Didn't he do something like ho 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 ho?
Exactly, that's exactly it.
Jesus, that was a long time ago.
Oh, we just showed our age on that one, didn't we?
No kidding.
That's back when
So did
TGIF
anyone
was
do
a thing.
Yeah, right, exactly. Anything exciting happening this week for anybody? We were just talking about our LGS is in the process of slowly moving location, so that was our off-mic conversation before we started up. But we had a guest in town last weekend. Ginger Joe was hanging out, so he was here for our long 3-day weekend, and we got to play some Magic. That was pretty fun.
Sure did. That was a blast.
That was the first time I've had to play with Chris in over a year, probably in person.
Yeah,
or just in general.
Yeah, because I work every Tuesday, so I don't get a chance to sit down and play, but now we were told going forward, seeing how so many people have been coming in the shop, that if people need games, we need to make sure that we go sit down with them if they can't find a pod. So
nice.
That's our thing going forward.
Very cool. I didn't go there. I didn't go this week, but I'll be going in next week, so I'll get a few games in for sure as well. So it's nice being able to go back and see people face to face and jam some Commander.
Oh, definitely.
Have you out there in listener land have gotten to play a few face to face games now that people are vaccinated and the world is slowly coming back to normalcy? How would you go about telling us about those games, Chris?
You can reach us on a multitude of social media platforms. You can find us on Twitter at CMDR Central. You can search us up on Facebook, CMDR Central. You can find us online at cmdrcentral.com, and you can also find us on YouTube by searching CMDR Central.
You can also head over to patreon.com/CMDR Central. Check out our reward tiers such as a Dexy Play episode, guesting on the show, or just joining our community to chat and play virtual EDH with all of us.
We also have a couple of contests going on. There's a giveaway that is wrapping up for a Phyrexian Swamp. And what was the other one, Max?
The Clash Pack from Fate Reforged, and both
yeah.
of those will be announced. Winners will be announced next week.
Very good. And I believe next week we have a deck tech coming down from you and Chris as well.
Yes.
Very exciting.
Yes, we do. And we also have new patrons to say hello to.
Oh, nice. Who do we have?
We want to say hello and thank you to Trevor Trombley, Brandon Hunter, and Ormondal Kime. I hope that's just a play on, it's Ormondal time. But if that's your real name, that's also really cool.
Very cool. Well, thanks to the three of you supporting us, and thanks for everyone out there who supports us, whether it's through Patreon or through just listening and voting on the show and giving us a couple star rating or a thumbs up. We really appreciate it. It means a lot and goes a long way to keeping things functioning here at Commander Central. Even though I guess we're not that centralized at the moment because we're still recording remotely, but we appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
Yes,
we're in the
thank you,
same
everybody.
town. It's close
That's true.
enough.
Yeah, absolutely.
But when you think about it, we may be in the same town, but if I leave my house, it still takes me 20 minutes to get to either one of your guys' houses.
That was always what killed me about the show 24, how Jack Bauer got across Los Angeles and, over commercial break. And I'm like, man, I can't get across this town of 70,000 people in 20 minutes.
When my dad used to work my dad works for Exo Energy, and when he used to be out on the truck fixing the power lines and stuff, he would say, I can get anywhere in town in 10 minutes. And I don't think that's true anymore, but it's what I grew up with. And I've said it out loud, I'll be there in 10 minutes. I can get from my house to Chris's house in 10 minutes. No, you can't. Without breaking laws, you can't get there.
I remember growing up, you could cruise around town that quickly, but not anymore.
Yeah, not these days. All right. Should we jump into this main show topic here, gentlemen?
Sure, it's better than someone cracking the world tree and putting 35 gods into play.
there we
or
go.
Trying to make 16 Terastodons.
Yeah, I heard about that. Or didn't Joe try some trying for the Horde shenanigans too? That got stone cold stopped.
Did. two blockers.
Very nice. So we did a show a few weeks back where we talked about having too many moving parts in your deck, and I guess this is kind of the corollary to that. We're going to talk about the decisions we made about how we limit the amount of moving parts in our decks, kind of, or what we choose to run, because you only have 100 cards. So, there's a lot of good counterspells. To use counterspells for an example, you could very easily put 15 or 20 counterspells in a deck that are all reasonable ones to cast. So how do you determine what deck gets 4 counter spells and what deck gets 8 or 10 or whatever. Like, how do we make that determination for our deck? Hopefully those kind of decisions will be insightful and help people out when you're struggling to make those decisions for your decks. So Max, I'm going to start with you because your Dromoka deck is fairly straightforward. And it's one you play a lot. It's probably the deck you know best.
Yes.
So like looking at that, the decisions you've made there about how many draw spells you want, how much ramp you want, how much removal you want to run, or board wipes, kind of walk us through how you've made those decisions for each of those kind of clusters and groups of cards for that particular deck.
Yeah, totally. So, like Dana said, my Dragonlord Dromoka deck is fairly straightforward. It's very battle cruiser magic-like. There's 21 creatures counting the commander, and the rest is all support for the deck. I really try to capitalize on the fact that when Dromoka is out, my opponents can't cast spells on my turn. So starting with draw, I kind of do the unconventional draw for a green deck. I rely on a lot of the draw that says target creature gets a power toughness buff, and then if it hits a player, draw that many cards. Because if Dromoka is out, I can cast something like Hunter's Prowess, which gives it +3/+3 in trample, making Dromoka an 8-power dragon that is probably going to hit the player right in the face if they don't have a blocker, and I'm going to draw 8 cards.
Yeah, cause like the risk of those in a traditional deck is you're going to get 2 for 1. So you'll cast the Soul's Majesty or Hunter's Prowess or whatever, and someone will just remove the creature and it fizzles, and that's sad at times. In your Dromoka deck, you just can't. So you're like, I'm just going to draw cards. Everyone's like, oh, that sucks. So yeah, okay, good call.
So I run a lot of cards like that. I run the Rishkar's Expertise, which are great in any deck, but having that security of you can't counter it. You can't get rid of my highest power creature. It's just really nice to know. And that kind of is the same how I look at my removal. I run a lot of removal in this deck. I think I have, 1, 2, 3, 4 board wipes at sorcery speed, single combat, austere command, and cleansing nova, and then Council's Judgment is the other sorcery speed removal spell. Specifically single combat I like is since my deck kind of revolves around Dromoka. If I can get everybody to sacrifice everything but a creature or a planeswalker, and I can keep Dromoka, I still have that 5/7 body sitting on the field for next turn to swing away, since nobody can cast creatures or planeswalkers till the end of my next turn. I really like those type of board wipes, which are more sacrifice than destroy, just because we see a lot of indestructible in our meta, and I've seen a lot of it, through virtual EDH, and sacrifice just gets around all of that.
Unless you play a Sigarda deck.
Unless you play a Sigarda deck, you're right, Chris. And then the instant speed removal is pretty much all targeted. Berserk, which is a removal spell, or can be used as one. Generous Gift, your Path to Exile, Swords to Plowshares, Unravel the Aether, along with Settle the Wreckage being that instant speed board wipe that just kind of comes out of nowhere and typically saves me from, being kicked out of a game.
Okay.
So pretty much you're saying you play the top tier removal package pretty much out of your instance.
Yeah, pretty much. I like to go with that top tier, not very unique, or, I didn't dig very deep on Scryfall for them. I know what I like. I know how I like to play, and I just want cheap, efficient removal.
Yeah, well, I mean, you can't get better than that. That's been tried and tested for how many years, and that's what is to go to.
Well, and this is also a deck talking about moving parts where you don't have that many. You've got a bunch of flying beaters that have some protection built in because of your commander. So you don't have to devote a whole ton of slots to making them even stronger or protecting them necessarily. It just limits the amount of moving pieces you have. And so therefore you can afford to run a little bit more control-y and run more removal and run all the premium pieces versus having to pick and choose.
Yeah.
For something a little bit less traditional that I guess we'll go over to Chris for, your Mogus Got a Slaughter deck.
Yeah, so this deck is definitely not on your traditional spectrum.
Particularly compared to Dromoka.
Yeah, I mean, it is playing the 2 best colors of Magic, black and red, so that's just where we're just better than Dromoka. That's how that works.
For sure.
No comment, Max? Come on.
That you spelt green wrong twice. But, I'll let it Friday. I'll let you have it.
So this deck is mainly built around, as I've said before, all about dealing damage every turn to every player. So in order to do that, I have to massively increase the influx of cards that are doing this type of effect. So that limits what else I can do. So as I'm looking through, Max, he started with what he's run from removal, and he laid out this huge package that he has. I have, if we include Chaos Warp as actual removal, That gives me 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pieces of removal in my deck. Now, that's not a lot, everyone says. What are you thinking? That's crazy talk. Well, this deck is meant to be pillow-forted behind, because I have other pieces in the deck that allow me to dodge having to play lots of removal, such as Maze of Ith, Ensnaring Bridge, Silent Arbiter, things like that prevent me from actually being massively attacked or, nuked out of a game. That's the plan for this deck, to dodge that whole too many moving parts things when it comes to removal. Now, the other feature that I put into this deck is that somehow these cards have to have a way of dealing out damage over turn. Now, there's a few cards in here that I haven't swapped out yet because I haven't found a better replacement, such as we'll discuss like Grave Titan. It doesn't deal damage every turn, but he creates zombies, which then in turn turn into, guess what? Now I have all these blockers to save myself. So, that's another thing that's, helping me with the lack of removal. This deck also plays quite a bit of like the card draw. I have a bunch of the red card draw and the black card draw because you need a critical mass of things on the board in order to do any of what you need to do. So you need to get to it faster, and the more that you can get out, the better. And that's the way that I took this deck. I'm only playing 19 creatures, 20 if you include my commander, which he's like a creature maybe once every 5 games if I'm lucky. I mean, I don't know how many times you guys have seen them as creatures, but it doesn't happen very often.
And they're not even creatures necessarily that you're looking to beat face with. They're creatures that are like adding something to your deck strategy for the most part.
Yes, like there's very few of them that actually ever beat face with, like a Tectonic Giant, for instance. He's the only one because guess what? When he attacks, I get to choose one and deal 3 damage to each opponent. So it's like, woohoo, just send him flying. I don't even care. It's like if someone wants to block him, that's fine.
Everybody
I got the 3
bolted.
damage in. Yeah.
Nice.
So that's my theory with that to, dodge the too many moving parts. Now, I'm currently having an issue with this deck that I'm trying to fit in more life gain into the deck because I've been killing myself faster than killing my opponents, which is not great. So that's the current conundrum that I'm stuck in right now.
Okay.
Well, I don't see Blood Bond on the list, so I mean, there's a great suggestion.
Okay, I did have Exquisite Blood.
You did, yeah.
In here at one point, that's one where you gain life whenever opponents take damage or whatever. And immediately when that hit the field, everyone thought I was running the combo. So they just, the whole table would turn on me. It's like,
remove it.
Good.
No, I just want to gain life. That's all I want.
Make them scared.
So I'm actually currently looking at other pieces to try to fit in here, which then becomes an issue because it's too many revolving parts. So that's, the conundrum of, do you cut some of your pieces of how you're playing to add up so you can survive longer? Or do you just go all in, balls to the wall, straight down the highway as fast as possible in one direction?
Very nice. Okay, so the one I'm going to bring up first here is my Asperia Supreme Judge Sphinx tribal deck. And when I first built it, I didn't necessarily have a plan for how it would play beyond I wanted to run Sphinxes. And we're talking like 6-ish years ago now when I first put this deck together. And your choices for Sphinxes were way weaker then than they are now. So I had things like Petra Sphinx from Legends. It was a reprint, I guess, in Time Spiral. But I mean, it's a bad white Sphinx. It doesn't fly. Goliath Sphinx, which is like a 8/7, I think, for 7 mana. That's just a vanilla flyer. Sarah Sphinx, that's basically a Sarah Angel as a Sphinx out of Time Spiral block. So again, pretty basic. So I had a lot of these the Sphinxes early on in this deck because there were only 24 of them in existence, and I had the best 17 or so, including things like Petra Sphinx. It was dire. But I wanted to run Sphinxes, so that's it. I had a limited creature pool to choose from, and I chose the best 16 or 17 because that was really all I could justify running. The rest of them were just too bad. So that gave me extra slots in my deck because usually a lot of times you're talking 20, 22 creatures in a lot of decks. I was running 16 or 17. That gave me some extra room to run a little more ramp, which is useful in a deck that has creatures that are all, 9 drops, or at least feels that way. So I put more mana rocks than I usually do in a deck. And I run 8 or 9 mana rocks, maybe tops, or at least ramp sources tops. I have 11 rocks in this deck, and I've always had that many more or less in this deck because, number one, I had extra room, and number two, you kind of need it when all your creatures are so expensive and your curve is relatively high. And I say curve, this deck isn't really a curve, it's a plateau. All of a sudden there's just a bunch of like 5, 6, 7 drops because that's where all the Sphinxes are. So the lack of good creatures, number one, forced me to not run a ton of creatures. The cost of the creatures made me want to run more ramp, and I had more room to run more ramp because I was running less creatures. So those two things kind of fed themselves and made that choice for me. And then again, because I just didn't have a ton of creatures, I still had a little more extra room. And because so many of these are expensive to cast, I needed to buy myself some time. So I run a few more counter spells than I would usually run. I've got an Arcane Denial in here. I have Delay, Dovin's Veto. There's a Mana Drain. There's an Overwhelming Intellect. There's a Swan Song. So like there's, all told 7 or 8 counter spells over the years. Like right now I've got 7, but I've had 8 at different points, maybe even 9 at some points. Again, because I need to live long enough to get these Sphinxes out and then protect them once I've spent that much mana getting them in play. So like that kind of designed itself really. Like the deck just was obvious and wanted to run more counter spells than I usually run just to protect my stuff. And then in addition to that, the same thing, I wanted board wipes that didn't always hit my stuff again because I don't want to recast 7-drop Sphinxes. So I have things like Aetherize and Aether Spouts. When someone swings at me, I can just mass bounce their board back to their hand. Cyclonic Rift, obviously, I'm not running Washout or Inundate to mass bounce spells that don't hit my things right now, but over the years, in the past, I've ran both of those as well, again, just to be able to hit the board and not touch my own stuff. And like right now, I still have Austere Command in there because if I want to, I can tweak that around not hitting my own Sphinxes. So that was something I did. This is a deck that very much pointed me in the right direction about how many of each of these category things I wanted to run. And you would think, since Asperia Supreme Judge says draw cards on the Planeswalker, I would need less card draw. But that really isn't the case. One of the things I discovered is, because it's whenever a creature attacks you or a Planeswalker you control, you may draw a card. People don't have to do that. Like something like Reki History Kamigawa, when I cast a creature, I draw a card. Like I'm in control of that. So I kind of know how reliable my draw is. I have an Edric deck that I don't play much, but like I can kind of control that. I draw a card when I do combat damage to somebody, play a bunch of creatures, draw a bunch of cards. That's on me. Asperia isn't on me. So it's card draw, but it's not card draw that I can rely upon. So I just treat it like a bonus. And I have a normal amount of card draw in this deck, despite the fact that my commander can potentially draw me a lot of cards, just because I don't know when that's going to work. And it's entirely possible I'll have games where no one's going to attack me until they're going to Alpha Strike, or they're playing a combo deck and they're never going to attack me anyway. And it's just not going to be a way to draw cards. So I have to run, a handful of card draw sources. In addition, this is a deck that works really, really well when I draw a bunch of cards, so I have more card draw than normal, so I can get to those counter spells. And I can make sure I have land drops on turn 7, when like a lot of times if you don't hit your land drop on turn 7, you're like, yeah, I can survive. I need them, because all my cards cost so much mana. So it's kind of forced my hand to run more card draw as well. So same thing with removal. I have a good amount of removal in here, targeted stuff, again, so I can survive long enough to get to that point where I can actually start playing these big, huge beaters.
Yeah, because that deck's definitely set up where, people are going to look at that and be like, okay, I don't want to give him, extra cards because he's playing all these fatties out of the game. Mm-hmm. Plus you're counterspelling stuff. So it's like, well, if I give him more cards, he's just going to draw more counterspells, or you're bouncing stuff. So overall, it's, in my, opinion of that deck, it reminds me of a blue-white control deck in a,
yes,
a regular format, a 60-card format, where you don't want to give your opponent the access to more of those cards. You want them to burn them out so then you can come in for the Alpha Strike.
Yeah, very much so. And that was not my plan. It just kind of one of those that it kind of just evolved that way because the deck steered me in those directions. I would, play it and one thing would work well. Well, let's add a second one of those things. And then that works well. So I add a third. Like the deck very much instructed me on how to build it over the years.
Yep. Now, did you ever run into that issue, where we're discussing, how going on to the subject that we had before of the too many revolving pieces, why we're putting these in so we don't run into it. Did you ever run into that snafu of too many revolving pieces?
Not really, because like one thing doesn't necessarily need something else to work. So this isn't a deck like my Veil of the Nightclad deck.
That's got a lot of revolving pieces.
There's a lot of pieces there, and they're kind of redundant pieces, so it's not that terrible, but there's a lot going on there. There isn't here. It's actually not that dissimilar from Max's Dromoka deck. It's flying beaters, so I already have ways to punch damage through because I have evasion on all my creatures. They're all big, so like even if I don't necessarily hit a True Conviction or an Akroma's Will or something, I can still, punch somebody in the face with 15 damage and flyers relatively easily, and it doesn't take that many turns to kill somebody doing that. Or things like, there's a few Sphinxes that have weird alt-win conditions on them as well, so that is useful also. So not really. This one is relatively straightforward. It's just I've had a lot of time to kind of figure out what the balance is and how many of each of those things I want.
Okay, makes sense.
So Max, we can go back to you. So we talked about your relatively straightforward deck, but I want to talk about one that's a little more complicated maybe, and that's your Tuvasa the Sunlit deck. Because in that particular deck, you're playing a commander that wants to have enchantments be cast, and you probably want enchantresses that draw you cards off casting those, but you need to find a way to win as well, and it's partially Tuvasa, but you don't want that to be your only win condition either. So what's your decision making there about how many of everything you want to run in that deck?
Yeah, so plan A is Tuvasa kills the table. That's always plan A with this deck. I run 37 enchantments in this deck.
Okay.
I run more enchantments than I do lands.
Oh, wow.
Nice. That's weird to say. Like you nailed it on the head. What I want to do is get Tuvasa out on curve, turn 3 right away, and hopefully have a 1-drop, 2-drop enchantment in my hand just to get her suited up or get something on the board like a Mystic Remora just to start drawing cards in addition to drawing off of Tuvasa. Where it comes more of the backup plans, though, is finding creatures that interact with enchantments. And I'm not just talking enchantresses that let me draw, but like Archon of Sun's Grace, which was from Theros Beyond Death. It has a constellation trigger of whenever an enchantment enters the battlefield under my control, make a 2/2 Pegasus creature with flying. So I have a lot of these extra creatures that benefit from the 37 enchantments I'm playing on top of all the enchantment creatures. So I'm really running like 40 plus enchantments in this deck. It's kind of a really well-tuned machine. If I have Tuvasa out, if I have card draw, if I have an enchantment creature in the deck that benefits from the enchantments entering the battlefield, it just starts to amass an army. So over time, it's like, well, we can take care of Tuvasa, but we still have, 20 Pegasi that we got to deal with in the air or something like that. I don't run a lot of standard draw in the deck just because of all the enchantresses. Tuvasa has it built into its text. I think I only run Thirst for Meaning just because that is like a Thirst for Knowledge for enchantments. So I can ditch an enchantment that I don't need right now to draw, 3 cards. Keep the 3 cards I drew. But, I run the standard Mystic Remora, Rhystic Study, Insight, on top of, Argothian Enchantress, Eidolon of Blossoms, Tuvasa, Citizen Champion, Satyr Enchanter, and of course the new white-green one from Modern Horizons 2 is going right into this deck.
That'd be such a good card. Oh.
Yeah. Now, you talked about in your Dromoka deck, Chris mentioned running premium removal spells, and there's no reason not to in that deck. There is in this deck, though, where you're perhaps rewarded for running an inferior Oblivion Ring or something over Generous Gift that's probably generally a better card. How do you find that balance between running something like a Swords to Plowshares or a Soul Snare that's on an enchantment that can do something similar but also has the possibility to draw you cards and add to Tuvasa's strength?
Right. So I do run a couple enchantment removal spells, we'll say. So I do run, maybe I don't. I did at one time. I want to be winning before turn 10 with this deck, ideally. So I run mostly, again, instant speed removal. I run the Beast Within, Generous Gift, Path, and some counter spells, and a Cyclonic Rift. But otherwise, for enchantments, it's Imprison in the Moon and Oblivion Ring, and Song of the Dryads. That would be the 3 enchantment-based removal I run. And that's more for, I would rather use the enchantment-based removal when, hey, you have a blocker in my way that's also doing you a lot of good things. I'd rather use an enchantment on something like that versus I'm going to Path to Exile that creature, because I'd rather you have something that you can't even block with versus giving you the land or getting rid of it for everybody, because worst case, if that enchantment does go away, everybody has to deal with that problem again, and it's not just me.
How about when it comes to ramp? Are you just using traditional green ramp or more enchantment-based ramp in that deck?
I run a little bit of enchantment-based ramp. When I first built this deck, I did run a lot of the enchant land or land auras, but right now I'm down to Fertile Ground, and that's it. Fertile Ground is the only one I run. This deck is super low to the ground. I think it's like 2.54 for its CMC, or 2.8.
Okay.
2.8 is its CMC, so I run, the Fertile Ground, and I run a Pier's Whim. Those are my two pieces of ramp in the deck. I do run like a exploration in case I do have a starting hand with a bunch of lands in it. It's a good way to get all the lands out of my hand and get Tuvas out maybe on turn 2. But this deck is really about knowing the type of hand you need to keep in that opening 7. So if you don't see, all 3 colors, or you don't see, if you have an open hand with like a Mystic Remora, a blue source, and a white source, I might keep that hand, because worst case, Mystic Remora on turn 1 or turn 2 might find me that extra land I need for turn 3.
And probably will. There's a good chance
It probably will.
For sure. Yeah.
Right. But I don't run your Kadama's Reaches, your Cultivates, your 3 Wishes, any of the traditional green ramp you would see in my Dromoka deck, because that takes away from the enchantments. And worst case, I can sandbag. I'm very good at that. If we have a new listener jumping in on episode 267, I can sandbag and just not play Tuvasa for a while and just maybe play out a couple like enchantments like an Aura Silence or a Sigarda's Aid, just to look like I'm doing something, but I'm really not doing anything.
Well, in Aura of Silence is a good example of a card that's good enough. It's good outside an Enchantress deck.
Yes, so it's annoying.
Yeah, so the utility in an Enchantress deck is just that much more powerful for sure.
Right. And I mean, I only run, so this is one of the few decks I play blue in, and I only run 2 counter spells. If I had to go through and retool this deck, I would probably take out Pact and put in like Fierce Guardianship or Negate, just because Pact and Negation isn't something I can fire off in my opening hand, because I'm not going to have the 5 mana to pay for it on my upkeep. I would ideally want another counter spell with a single blue pip, because I am in 3 colors. I can't guarantee I'm always going to have 2 blue or 3 blue available to pay for a counter spell when I desperately need it.
That totally makes sense in that deck. So that's a situation where, like, now if they came out with, Swan Song 2 and Swan Song 3 or whatever, would you find a room for them, or do you think you have that, like, the couple you have is enough in that deck?
I think because this deck is really like I said, it's very fast. So if I'm not winning by turn 5 or 6, or in a good position on the table, I'm fine with the 2 counter spells I have, because the game's probably going to go long, and I'd rather wait to use them when it might be pivotal to turn the game in my favor later turns.
Sure, makes sense.
I'm also not a big fan of conditional counter spells. That's why I probably haven't put Fierce Guardianship in there. I like the hard counter. I like to be able to counter anything versus a non-creature spell or sorcery, instant, and enchantment like Swan Song does, because you never know when that Ugin's going to drop and it's just going to wipe all colored permanents off the battlefield. Well, that hoses my entire deck. Right. I have no artifacts in this deck. I need a hard counter for something like that.
Okay, that makes sense.
So why don't you run like Dovin's Veto or Negate then? They're both low casting on that, but they do non-creature spells. So, and that's pretty much what you're worried about mainly, is the non-creatures.
Right. Dovin's Veto, because it's 2 colors like blue and white. There are other white instants in the deck where I'd rather save the white mana for that. I run Teferi's Protection, Enlightened Tutor, stuff like that. Negate, it's just finding the slot. I don't know if taking out Pact and Negation for Negate is it's probably better long term, if I did it for 200 games, but the deck works fine how it is, and I don't want to put a third one in here, I guess, because I like just being able to say, hey, this is a super fast deck, but I only run 2 counter spells. So there's been games where I'm like, well, I cast Arcane Denial on turn 4. The only counter spell left in my deck is Pact and Negation, and I don't have it. And so, like, it's a good way to maybe play a little politics and be like, I don't have any counter spells left, or I only have 1. Who knows where it is? And I have no way to tutor for it. I don't run, Mystical Tutor or anything like that.
Okay, now for this deck, how did you decide then to keep the revolving parts to a minimum, because, you are on enchantment, so it limits you already. You're not going to play any artifacts. So, but how do you keep it from choosing between auras and your static base enchantments then? Like, how did you keep that number in check so you don't go overboard on one or the other?
I would probably say this is a little overboard on auras versus the static enchantments, just because I wanted this to be more equipment type Voltron versus piling up a bunch of static enchantments Voltron, because I've seen Tuvasa lists that play that way. I've seen Tuvasa lists that play like mine that are just all auras. It kind of came down to when I built this list, I took it off of a content creator's budget list. By the time I got the cards, I was going through my binder and be like, oh, I do have one of these, I do have one of these, I do have one of these. So it went from a budget deck to absolutely not a budget deck.
Isn't that how they all go?
Yeah.
And it just kind of came down to like, what do I like to play? I like playing Sylvan Library. Well, let's put that in here. And I like playing, what's a good aura here? Aqueous Form, a single blue, unblockable, on attack, you scry. I tried to find, when I look at auras for this deck, they need to give the creature some sort of evasion or some sort of power and toughness increase. So like Aqueous Form gives it unblockable. Armadillo Cloak buffs its power and toughness and gives it lifelink and trample. Battle Mastery gives it double strike. There's just a bunch of these little auras that cost 1 to 3 mana that give it flying and +1/+1. Well, okay, now Tuvasa is a 5/5 for all we know. Where the static enchantments, I want them to maybe not be taxing, but I want them to do something that makes it seem like, okay, we need to either take care of that or not take care of that because it might not be that bad. So like Brave the Sands gives all my stuff vigilance and can block extra stuff. It's not that scary early game, but when Tuvasa's a 30/30 and can block 2 things, that is kind of scary. So it just kind of came down to playstyle for me. I try not to have a lot of redundancy in my static enchantments, unless they're like removal, but like I don't have 2 ways to clone things. Like I have a Mirror Maid, that's it. I have a Ghostly Prison, I don't run Propaganda also. I think the only things that are like redundant are the auras that buff Tuvasa. So like I have Armadillo Cloak and I have Unflinching Courage. So like the updated one. I just really tried to find stuff that gave the creatures evasion and power boost, because you're not going to get through any other way.
Okay. Now, Dana, did you run into that issue when you were building your Sigarda deck? Because it's very similar.
It helps that Sigarda herself has evasion.
Okay.
So the fact that she has flying, and she's also less likely, I think Max is a little more vulnerable to targeted removal than I am, again, because she has hexproof too. So those 2 keywords on that card make my life a little bit easier. And it's 2 colors. Now, that means I don't have access to counter spells, but I also don't have to worry necessarily about what the pip count is in cards or anything.
Oh, I suppose that also made it easier, so you can't jam as much into a deck if you're limited down to the number of colors.
Yeah, because there's times like you just have too many options. Then when you get to 3 or 4 colors, it's way easier for me too. I just don't have to even make the decision because there's just less things to choose from. And there's things like, too, it solves the problem. Max is using a little bit less in the way of land, enchantment, ramp spells, because there's things like Utopia Sprawl that cares about going onto a forest. Well, if you're in a 3-color deck, Max is running way less forest than I am in a 2-color deck. I always have a target for Utopia Sprawl. I would imagine in Max's deck, as efficient as that card is, he would find himself without a land to put it on pretty frequently.
Yeah, that would make sense too. Yeah.
So,
especially since you're not playing the ramps to ramp out basic forests or anything like that. So
yeah. Well, Chris, since we're just talking about Max, let's jump over to you. What deck would you like to talk about now?
I don't care. You guys pick one.
I'm curious about your Alesha deck, because that's a deck that has a lot of things you're trying to do. So I'm trying to figure out how you balance what you want to run there.
Okay, so I'm going to discuss the version that I have on Archidect right now, because I am in the process of changing it back to tokens.
Okay.
So the version I have on Archidect is an ETB theme, which for anyone who's new to the game, that means enter the battlefield. I actually had this question the other day with the new players, like, you guys keep saying ETB, what does that mean? And I'm like, enter the battlefield. He's like, oh, okay, that makes sense.
Good point. I don't think of that, but yeah, no, good call.
Yep. So these are all enter the battlefield effects, and it builds up into, big beaters eventually hit the field, all that fun jazz, and I reanimate them and stuff like that. Now, this deck's primary weakness, by far, is the graveyard. If I don't have a graveyard, I'm just boned or whatever. And there's not a whole lot of cards in the game that protect that, so you just kind of play through it. And in order to play through it, you got to play, for me anyways, I'm playing a massive amount of creatures that are high value, like massive amounts of value to them, along with a bunch of tutors, so I can tutor up these creatures as well. Let's see, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 tutors in this deck, I think. Yeah, 6 tutors in this deck to tutor up the creatures. Now, people, they're always talking about, well, you play too many tutors and you're going to tutor up combo, which I am playing combo in this deck, but that comes down to how you are as a person when you're playing. Like, do you want to be that, the person on the table that everyone gets mad at because all you do is tutor up your combo every time?
Sure.
Or do you want to just tutor up the pieces of your deck to make the deck run more efficiently? And that's the way I look at tutors, is I'm going to tutor up the pieces that I want to run efficiently. Like, I play both, what's the name of the 2 recruiters, the red one and the white one.
Oh, Imperial Recruiter and, I forget the white one.
Recruiter of the Guard.
Recruiter of the Guard. Yep. I play both of those. Now, when they come out, so you can tutor up either your Kiki Jiki or your Felidar Guardian with those cards, which I do not do. Personally, what I do whenever I draw either of those cards is I tutor up whatever I want, mainly Stoneforge Mystic, because then I go from Stoneforge Mystic into the Skull Clamp, and then Skull Clamp all my little guys and start, getting the card draw engine going, which, people don't get upset about. So that's where I deem tutors are fine, and this is a deck that I run massive amounts of tutors to help with that. This deck is also in the way of not a whole lot of removal to it, but enough to really, help you with your game plan. Like, I'm running your nice removal, your Anguish Unmaking, Path to Exile, Swords to Plowshares, Vindicate, that kind of stuff, to remove anything on the board that I need to get through with stuff. Now, the other issue that I run into this deck is that if I ever play against, we'll say, like your Sphinx deck, Dana, where you have these big beaters out, I can't win through that. It's
Sure.
nearly impossible because they're too big. My creatures are smaller, but I can maybe swarm you out, because a couple of them start creating tokens, or I can go just faster than you or get around stuff. And that's the overall game plan for this deck. Now, the issue I run into most of the time with a deck like this is that it is 3 colors. And you have an issue of not running, the right land base and stuff, because
Right.
you need other good lands. So I play a couple more, like the Mana Rock base, like I got the Arcane Signet, all the other Signets, the Chromatic Lantern, Soul Ring, all those types of things to try to, smooth out the mana base. Now we're running into, now I'm cutting the deck way low on other stuff. You're like, where's your card draw at? Well, I do play card draw too, and that is mainly in the form of your red card draw, which allows you to discard. And I chose that over the black card draw due to the simple fact of that this is mainly a reanimator deck, so I want to pitch stuff into the graveyard. So, I mean, Dana, you've discussed this before about how it's hard to discard. And for me, it's not. I just look at a card, I'm like, yeah, I don't need this. Chuck it in the
Sure.
graveyard. Don't care. It's gone forever. If someone, Bajuka bogs me, I guess we just live with that decision later. So, and that's mainly how I built this deck and how I play it. The token version of this deck, like I said earlier, that I'm redoing, it's meant to just reanimate guys who come in with an enter the battlefield effect that also brings in guys with them, like a Ponyback Brigade or Beetleback Chief or anything, mainly goblins, because they're pretty much the only ones that do that kind of fun jazz. That give you multiples for one creature coming back. And that's what I wanted to do with this deck, is to make it a theme base where enter the battlefield, something happens where I get exponential value on whatever card that is.
So basically the way your deck kind of works is your creatures take care of a lot of the jobs that sometimes in other decks you need to devote instant sorceries to.
Yes, that's a big thing. Like, I don't play a whole lot of permanents aside from the creature base. Now, there's a few of them that support the creature base, such as your Cathar's Crusade, Eldrazi Monument, that kind of stuff, just because you need a little bit of that support somewhere. But the rest of the stuff, I don't play a whole lot of anything else.
I can see how that works out that way for sure.
Now, the thing I wanted to bring up too with this deck, and I've noticed this going through all my deck lists, and you guys have not brought them up neither, is we don't play a whole lot of Planeswalkers.
That's
No.
true, yeah.
Yeah, which is really weird because I see a lot of people, like, I got to jam at least, like 3 or 4 Planeswalkers in a deck, because they're so powerful. But Planeswalkers, if, in my opinion, when I build a deck and I have all these pieces moving, if they're not supporting those pieces, they're not a good card. It doesn't need to be in here. So I cut them.
I totally agree with that, Chris.
Yeah.
I mean, I used to run Sarah the Benevolent in Jermoka because it was the first Planeswalker that made flying creatures, essentially. But over time, fit theme, but it just couldn't get support in the deck I had built. I bet it would do great in your token version of this deck because you already have an army to protect Sarah. I ran into the issue of I never had something out to protect Sarah, even with the token she generates.
Yeah, I play Sarah in Angels just because it fits theme to start creating Angels, and I usually use her to create Angels. There was one game quite a while ago where we had the board state stalled out and no one was doing anything, so I just kept upticking her to altar because I had nothing else to do with her, so...
Nice. Yeah, no, because, for example, two that jump out at me, the Ashiok and the Narset, both from War of the Spark. Like, if you can run both of those two in any deck, you're probably right. They're both really efficient. They both don't hurt you while, like, crippling your opponents. They're just two fantastic cards, and like, power-wise, if you can put those in your deck is probably stronger, generically speaking, for having them in the deck. But I want all my pieces to work together and do something, and if they're not doing what I want my deck to be doing, it's just less, like, even if they're stronger, it's not as much fun.
Agreed.
So yeah, I don't run many, and when I do, it's almost always Planeswalkers that are doing something with what the deck wants, like Tezzeret's in my Vela deck, for example. Yeah,
now, like in Alesha, I'm running Kaya Ghost Assassin and Nahiri the Harbinger. Now, Nahiri, she's meant in there as pitching cards, or she could be a removal outlet. I have alted her before, to tutor up something just because I had nothing else going on. But now Kaya Ghost Assassin allows me to kind of blink creatures, which is phenomenal. Yes, it takes, a turn before they come back and I lose life, but hey, more enter the battlefield effects.
There we go. Yeah,
totally makes sense. Yeah, that's the way when I look at Planeswalkers, I don't just jam them willy-nilly into a deck to go to town unless we talk about my Amanatu deck, and that was just every Planeswalker I can.
Well, the last one I'm going to talk about is one, my Sphinx deck was relatively straightforward, and it kind of directed me in how to make the choices I've made. My Kresh the Bloodbraided deck is a little trickier. So number one, it's a 3-color deck. And number two, I have kind of two separate themes going on. Number one, all the creatures care about +1 counters. So I have support cards that interact with +1 counters. Things like Doubling Season and Hardened Scales and Branching Evolution that synergize with putting counters on things.
Oh, please tell me you got the new Vorinclex in there too.
New Vorinclex is in here.
Yes.
But I also have, it's a Fling deck. So like I'm running, Fling and Thud and things like Soul's Fire, which, functionally works like a fling and makes a creature deal damage to a player. Essence Harvest is a black one that does something similar. So I have, 8 or 10 of these cards that let me have creatures deal direct damage to a player. So that's a lot of slots that are being soaked up by two of the kind of themes in the deck. The reason I'm able, and it's also a 3-color deck, so like there's just that much more need for color fixing and ramp and whatever. One reason the deck works, even though there's a bunch of moving parts here, is because I don't have to worry about combat damage for the most part. So, a lot of times in a green deck, you'll see people running their Overwhelming Stampedes or your Crater Hooves for your overruns to make sure they can punch that damage through because, big beater creatures don't always have evasion, and if they don't have trample, you need to give them trample or someone's just going to chump block your 20/20 with a 1/1, and that's not good. I'm not planning on swinging at people. No, I do sometimes. You'll get those situations where like I just happen to play a creature that's 16/16 and someone doesn't have blockers for whatever reason and I can hit them for 16 damage. I will absolutely do that. But it's not what my plan is to win. My plan is to make these creatures giant and then throw them at somebody right to the face. Additionally, a lot of that stuff is kind of instant speed too. And these creatures are supposed to die, so I don't really have to worry about protection that much. I don't need to worry about Lightning Greaves as a haste enabler or protection or Swiftfoot Boots as a way to do the same thing. So despite the fact that the deck is demanding a lot of slots, it also lets me avoid having to worry too much about slots for those things. So when someone goes to remove the 20/20 creature that I just played, well, I can cast Soulfire at instant speed, or I can cast Fling at instant speed, and it was, it's in play to die anyway. So if you go to remove it, I'll just remove it myself and dome you for 20, and then put those counters on the Crash. So the deck, the way it works, it's got a lot of demands on what I run, but it also kind of lets me skip out on a few of those steps. And another example of that is in terms of the draw spells I run. I've got things like Momentous Fall in here, or Greater Good, or Life's Legacy that require you to sacrifice a creature to draw cards equal to its power. Well, if I make a giant creature, I could just sacrifice it to one of those effects, draw a fistful of cards, and yes, the creature goes away, but the counters go over onto Kresh, or they go over onto the Ozolith, or they go over onto Rayhan Last of the Obzan. So yes, I'm killing the creature, but there's a lot of times the counters and the power of that creature just get moved elsewhere, and then when I draw 20 cards, I'm hopefully hitting a Soul's Fire or a Fling or something, where then if I need to, I can use Kresh for that poke to hit somebody, and then I'm in a great position to rebuild immediately because I've just drawn so many cards.
Yep. Now, immediately with you talking about this deck, for those of you that don't know, Kresh is in Jund.
Yes.
So that gives you access to black. Now, if I were to build this deck, my first build would involve a whole bunch of reanimation themes.
Sure.
Which then becomes way more moving parts
in
the deck, and you chose to just cut that immediately just because you don't care. If they die, they're gone, they're never coming back, but I get the counters to go somewhere else because I'm sticking to a singular mindset of doing something.
Yeah. And this, again, wasn't a deck where, this wasn't my plan. I just thought, hey, I want to build a Fling deck, and Kresh would work for that, since the stuff I fling would make Kresh bigger, so let's just put it together. And then as I played it, I kind of discovered, well, I can pull out this overrun, and I can pull out these Lightning Greaves, because, well, in the case of Lightning Greaves, it actively made it so I couldn't target Kresh with some of the Fling effects. Some of them are actually targeted, some of them are sacrificed, but some are targeted. It's like I couldn't target Kresh with Gravitic Punch or something. So as I played, I discovered, I can pull out a couple of these cards because they don't work or I can't use them anyway, and that just frees up space to put something else in.
Now, with a deck like this, since you're limited on the amount of flings that there are in the game of Magic, did that open up more avenues for you to do other stuff within the deck?
It did a little bit, but I've actually kind of hit the point where I don't even know if I need any more. Because they've given us a couple in the last year. We got Kazul's Fury that was in the newest Zendikar set that works. And it's an MDFC card too, so I could use it as a land if I don't need it. And then they made a rule change, so even commanders actually, when they die, they hit the graveyard. There's an enchantment from Gatecrash called Dying Wish that goes on a creature you control. And when the creature dies, target player loses X life and you gain X life, where X is its power. So prior to that rule change, if I put it on Crash, it didn't do any good. Because if Crash died, it was a replacement effect and it was an exile and it went to my command zone. That's not true anymore. Now I can put Dying Wish on Crash when he's giant, and if he gets killed or I sacrifice him, or fling him, even better, fling him at one person and use the Dying Wish trigger on somebody else.
That's disgusting.
So in the last year, I think I've kind of actually hit the point where I have enough of those fling effects. Because we were at the point where when a new one would come out, like Gravitic Punch came out a couple years back in the third Ravnica block, I'm just going to hard jam those. Kazul's Fury, hard jam it. Dying Wish worked, I put it in. I'm at the point now where I can't think of the last time I played this deck where I didn't have one in hand or wasn't able to draw down to one pretty easily. So I think we're at this point where if we get a new one, it'll be a matter of replacing the worst one versus just running them all.
Yeah. Now, you're also in colors that have really good removal.
Mm-hmm.
In board wipes per se, not really targeted removal. But do you run a whole bunch of those then?
I don't run very much in this deck at all either. And there are some Kresh lists that do, because I've seen the builds where they try to give Kresh indestructible and then just wipe the board repeatedly so he gets huge and then you can hit somebody. Yep. I don't. I'm running 2 board wipes. I've got Blasphemous Act in part because it's just so crazy efficient for the most part. It's almost always just 1 mana. But Chandra's Ignition is both a board wipe and a win condition. If I've got a 2020 in play, I'm probably just going to kill everybody with Chandra's Ignition.
Okay. I was curious about that because, we're discussing, what pieces we put into a deck, and in those colors, you have just the amazing pieces to do stuff like that. So, but you're dodging it, which we discussed before is, sometimes you just got to sacrifice something to make the deck work better.
Well, and there's a couple ones in here too that Culling Ritual isn't a board wipe necessarily, but it destroys each non-land permanent with mana value 2 or less.
Ugh.
That gets underneath.
Card is so good.
Yeah, it is. It gets underneath Crash, so Crash survives because he's a 3/3 that costs 5 mana. So Crash lives. It's going to kill everyone's mana dorks and that kind of thing, and then make Crash bigger in the process.
Yep.
There's a card called Flowstone Slide that's X2 red. So minimum it's going to cost me 5 mana to cast.
Really, you play that?
Yeah. But all creatures get +X, -X on a turn. So even if I just set it to 2 at 5 mana, Crash will survive that, and he will become a 5/1 to end a turn. But every creature that's toughness less than 2 becomes a 4/0, and Crash gets counters based on power. So it wipes a bunch of creatures and makes Crash that much huger.
So you just keep it on theme. Okay,
Yeah.
I understand that. That works perfect. That's what I like to see when people build a deck, is that they keep their cards onto the theme that actually boosts the power of their deck, and they're not just, playing the best willy-nilly cards just because they're the best willy-nilly cards.
Right. Well, in one extra advantage in this deck too, because I'm in Jund and I have access to 3 colors, when I'm running targeted removal, I have access to things like Assassin's Trophy that hits any target, or Beast Within that hits any target, or Chaos Warp any target. So like most of the removal I'm able to run here are things that just universally hit a bunch of stuff. Even under sorceries, Hull Breach hits artifacts and enchantments. Putrefy hits multiple different things as well. So I have my removal in this deck, because I'm 3 colors, I can run maybe slightly less than I normally would, because every piece I have is going to hit like 3 or more card types too. So that helps a ton. I don't have to be like, oh, I hope I draw my 1 or 2 ways to remove, creatures or enchantments or whatever, because so much of my stuff will hit anything that's a problem.
Yep. So now, you discussed, you're playing big beater creatures. You're playing ways to, pump your creatures up in terms of, getting counters out there. Then you're flinging. Then you have this small removal package. So you're in green. Are you playing any sort of a ramp package then in there? Because now it seems like we're having too many cards in this deck that are trying to do too many things.
I do have ramp, but not a ton. So I have, like, under artifacts, I've got a Soul Ring, and I guess the Great Henge would count. But
I don't know if that counts.
Yeah, because that's not giving you mana till you've already ramped, basically. So I've got 1 artifact in a handful of the good sorcery land ramp things. There's a Farseek in here, Nature's Lore, Rampant Growth, and 3 visits. So I think I have only 6 or 7 traditional ramp spells, but I have a few mana dorks that play with the deck's theme. So like Gyre Sage is a mana dork, but it has Evolve. And so therefore, when I put a counter on it from something, maybe I'll have a Hull Breacher out, or a Corpsejack Menace, or Doubling Season or something. So it's pretty easy for that Gyre Sage, or something like, let's see, what's the other one in here? Incubation Druid. It's pretty easy for those to just accidentally wind up being able to tap for 4, 5, 6 mana sometimes.
Okay. That would make sense then. Yep. So I was just trying to, branch out, because this is a 3-color deck. So I want people to see, how many pieces you have revolving in this deck, but you're keeping it, down-tuned a little bit of each type, so you can keep the deck working properly.
And that is a good point, because I talked about how I could get away with running a few less things because I'm not doing combat damage. Well, that is one area I've had to skimp. Like, very rarely do you see a green deck that only has 5 ramp spells in it for the most part, and a couple mana dorks. That's one area I've had to skimp. Like, I just don't have room for more ramp than that. And given a choice between ramping slower and playing slower, or having less, say, removal or something, I've chosen to cut back on the ramp versus something else. So that's the one area I've had to be picky and choosy is in the ramp.
Okay. That does make sense then.
Yeah.
Yeah, because the other deck of yours that I was thinking of that I know that you cut out a whole crap ton of one thing was your Kedis and Crom deck, where you're only playing 2 creatures in the deck.
Well,
so you have that cuts out 25 cards out of a usual deck that you can do other stuff with.
Yeah, and that's a deck where I'm I have to run a ton of buff spells and stuff. So that was where I made the choice there. Yeah, that's going one where it's very much to the extreme. Okay, well, hopefully that was interesting and useful to hear how we made some of these choices about what tools we're going to run in our particular toolboxes for a couple of our decks. Any final thoughts here from you guys, from you, Max? Any last words of wisdom?
I mean, this takes time. We didn't just build these decks last night and they miraculously work
right.
the first time you play them. I mean, I've had Dramoka since I pretty much started playing Magic Dragons of Tarkir, I guess. So 6 years. I've had Brago for 5 years. I've had Tuvasa for 3 years. They take time and they take a lot of trial and error. So don't give up is what I would say is my piece of advice, is don't give up unless you are just flat out unhappy and you think you've tried everything, because I've been there before too. It's called playing Boros. But just keep trying. Don't give up, especially if you really like the concept you have. Maybe it's the wrong commander. Maybe you're in the wrong colors. You'll eventually get it dialed in.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. I can actually, put a personal experience into this, and that's I'm still working on that Dragon's Approach deck. And a good piece of advice is reach out to your fellow players. If you are part of our Slack or whatever, reach out to those people. Reach out on Twitter for anyone that you know that's talking, or any of the other social media or personal people that you know. And, they'll help you out, because right now I discussed some things in Slack with some of our other people, and they're all running the same issue with the Dragon's Approach deck. So instead of cutting the deck completely, I'm actually rebuilding it to try it in a new, fashion and see if it works that way. Even though I think the deck I'm absolutely mad at it. I want to throw it across the room right now. But, I'm going to keep trying until, finally it just comes down to the point where it's either going to work or it's not. And then you just got to move on and, live free, have fun.
For sure. All right, that is going to wrap up this episode of Commander Central. If you are looking to get a hold of me, you can find me on the Twitter birds at Dana Roach. You can find Max at CMDRCentral_Max, and you can find Chris at WiseSquishy1. Our podcast theme is Retro Future Dirty by Kevin MacLeod, licensed via Creative Commons, and our show was edited by the great Rafael Garcia, who you can find online at Ursa Bearwalker. We'll be back this Thursday with another deck tech, and next Monday with a new show. Until then, I am Dana.
I'm Max.
And I'm Chris.